When I finally got the keys to the little stone cottage, I felt like I'd stolen a small planet. It was the sort of place people put in home decor magazines and sigh about, not the kind of thing my family assumed I could or would buy. I moved like a woman who'd been practicing solitude for a decade, measured, careful, decisive. This cottage wasn't just a house. It was a contract I'd written with myself. No more being everyone's emergency fund. No more living in the margins of other people's plans. It was mine. I could finally put the kettle where I wanted and leave the curtains closed until I decided otherwise. I pulled up in the driveway on a late summer afternoon, 2 boxes in the back of my tired sedan, and the key still warm in my palm like a chastening promise. The garden smelled of crushed time. Sunlight pooled in the kitchen where the cabinets were exactly the wrong color for the realtor's staged photos, perfect in its wrongness. I pushed the front door and found the living room full of other people's laughter. There was Janet, my mother, who has the uncanny ability to make any situation sound like a long-term plan disguised as love, sitting on my new sofa, an arm looped through a casserole dish. Behind her, like some unfortunate extra in a family sitcom, was Maya, my sister, already discussing where the crib might go. They looked up when I came in, their faces folding for half a breath into surprise, and then, with the competence of people who have rehearsed an improvisation, into a blend of flustered charm and entitlement. Maya smiled the way someone smiles when a bank teller opens a vault for them. Janet's casserole dish wobbled like a prop. "Summer!" Janet said, like she hadn't known where I was for months. We didn't know you'd be back so soon. How is it? Isn't it lovely?" "It's my house," I said. The words should have landed like a bell, clear and factual. Instead, they thudded into the carpet where a dozen imagined conversations were waiting to be edited on their phones. Maya had my key on a ring between her thumb and forefinger. She showed it to me like a magician displaying a rabbit. "We copied it a while ago," she said, casual as weather. "You know, just in case. Kids' schedules, it'll be easier if we had a spare." Her mouth was smiling, her eyes were not. Janet added with the sort of warmth that fogs a mirror, "We can help you with the upstairs. We'll just take the back room and convert it for the kids. We can move the old cedar chest to the garage. You'll have the kitchen and the study." All the air left my chest, the way it does when you realize a bank account has been drained or a confidence betrayed, a slow, stupid vacuum. The cottage wasn't a spare to them. It had been, apparently, a rehearsal space for their future. I should have been calm. I had rehearsed a speech. Measured, calm, containing facts and threats of police if necessary. What came out instead was tighter, small, and bright with anger. "You copied my keys?" I asked. "Yes," Maya said, like she just said, "We might come by next week for dinner." Her voice had the apologetic tone of someone announcing a plan they believed was inevitable. "We already started making lists," Janet said. She produced, with the theatricality of someone reading from a menu, a folded notepad. "Garage for the bikes? Study for us. The windows in the sunroom? We thought the kids would love that." 2 minutes. I gave them 2 minutes to leave. Sometimes the body knows what to do before the mind finishes arguing. I didn't have the luxury of rational negotiation. This cottage was the ledger item where my name alone balanced the scales. The stakes were not furniture. They were the psychological architecture of my life. If I allowed them to colonize it for convenience, I would be back to being the person who opened the door when everyone knocked but never had one to call her own. I watched them gather their things, casserole, a child's shoe that wasn't mine, a game box, and leave as though they had considered my emotions and decided them negotiable. After they left, the house hummed with the placebo calm of cleared rooms. I locked the door twice and sat on the floor among my boxes, the kind of stillness that isn't peace, but a waiting room for the next terrible thing. My hands shook while I scrolled through messages, looking for anything that might be an accident or a misread. Scrolling, I found Maya's post. It had been public, dated 3 weeks before I signed the final papers at the escrow office. The caption was breezy, the kind of entitled optimism she uses to recruit allies. "Big plans. Kids will love the bigger place. Finally enough room for everyone. Can't wait to get the family settled." The photo was of a dinner table. The comments were full of heart emojis and offers to help paint. It hit like discovering your friends have been RSVPing your life without you. My chest tightened again as I opened a new message thread with my father, Robert. I never expected that message. It was a short one, and it was a mistake. As if he had typed to Maya and realized too late his thumbs had betrayed him. "Don't worry," the message read. "She'll give in. She always does." That little line, a sentence that had been casually tossed to the side like a dish towel, ignited a kind of white-hot clarity. It wasn't about the cottage being big enough for a crib. It was about an entire script my family had written where my independence was merely a pause before the inevitable help. Betrayal is a particular flavor of grief. Not for death, but for a version of yourself that believed family was protection. I thought of every time I'd lent money and had been praised for being so generous, every time I'd canceled plans to watch someone else's children, every time I'd been the person who bent like a flexible ruler until my own corners were gone. They had used affection as currency and assumed I'd be the ATM. I started to inventory what they had taken besides my keys: time, the narrative of who I was allowed to be, and the assumption that my boundaries were temporary decorative pieces. The cottage was the last ledger item standing under my name, and I could feel them already dividing it into checkboxes. That night, I did the small, incensurable things of someone who has been thrown a line and refuses to be hauled in. I changed the locks. I wrote up a list of every key I'd ever handed out and where it had gone. I backed up my emails. I took photographs of the rooms with timestamps embedded in my phone. Quiet, small acts that felt like armor. The adrenaline didn't leave. It sat with me like an insistent guest, reminding me that comfort would have to be earned, not assumed. I slept on the couch that first night, not because I couldn't climb to the bed, but because I needed to stay where the noise of the house felt honest. When my phone lit up with another family group chat ping, a single line of cheerful messages about what color to paint their room, I screenshot it and sent it to myself with the caption, "Do not forget." I was awake before dawn. The yard was a cold, gray hush, and inside, the cottage smelled faintly of someone else's coffee. The grief was still there, a small, bitter internment, but under it, a clear pulse. This house was the boundary line. I had drawn it, and if they wanted to cross it, they would have to do more than assume. Part 1 ends here, with the discovery and the first small acts of defense. I had two realities in my hands: their conviction that I would bend, and the stubborn, furious knowledge that I wouldn't. The next step was to turn those small defenses into an actual plan. They called it a family dinner. They placed the words like a velvet rope around what was actually an ambush. I agreed because refusing would let them frame me as dramatic, and because sometimes you have to sit through someone's theatrics to see the script in plain print. We met at my mother Janet's house. I arrived with a salad and the kind of polite smile you learn to deploy like a tool. The table was set for 6, placemats perfectly aligned like militia. My father, Robert, presided like an embarrassed mayor. Maya didn't hide the pace at which she had been rehearsing the lines, the tilt of her head when she spoke about helping, and the earnest, practiced sympathy she reserved for people who needed changing. They told me they loved me. They told me how proud they were that I'd bought the cottage. They told me this in the same breath as they told me the plan. "We thought the best move," Janet said, placing a napkin down like a gavel, "would be for us to all live together. It'll be easier for the kids' summer. A 5-bedroom place. Everyone together. Think of the savings." Maya, soothing, had already set up a slideshow on her phone. Floor plans for a house that did not bear my name, a gallery of sofas and bunk beds, a numbered list of who would get which closet. She kept using "we" as if I were an idea they'd already included. "So," Robert chimed with that paternal shrug that equals coercion in their dialect, "you sell the cottage. We'll co-sign if you need help for a down payment. We've already called your bank. They were very helpful. We thought we could move the garage stuff, the bikes, and the cedar chest. The kids get the back bedroom. It's practical." They had, in fact, called my bank. They had, in fact, started itemizing furniture. The only surprise was the competence of their audacity. Maya slid across an email thread on her phone where someone claiming to be me thanked a bank officer. The message was clean. The wording sounded like me from someone who'd spent a decade learning my cadences. They'd even penciled in dates for escrow and a timeline for painting. I remember that evening, something soft and animal in me stopped asking questions and started counting. I counted all the times I'd been told, "We know what's best," and how often my consent had been cataloged as a formality. I counted the ways people who loved you can also plot around you like your empty space to be filled. I refused. I refused in a voice that was small, then found volume. "You contacted my bank without my permission?" I asked. "You planned renovations for a house I haven't bought? You acted like I was a placeholder?" Maya's expression flickered. Janet's smile set like cement. "We're just being practical," Janet said. "You can't live alone forever." "We already did the math," Maya said. "It's better for the kids. You always want to help. This is helping." I left the dinner with a plate of uneaten roast and a clearer sense of the ledger. They'd been preparing for this without me, and they'd pre-spent the grace they thought I would hand over. That's when the campaign started. It's almost quaint to call it a campaign, like it has marching bands and leaflets. Actually, it smelled more like the slow, corrosive work of someone who thinks persistence is permission. Step 1, social media. Maya posted a curated version of the dinner. Photos of Janet arranging napkins and Robert laughing, with captions about family unity, and about how Summer is so generous, always thinking of everyone. The comments were a parade of sympathizers, friends, extended family, a few church folks. The algorithm, opportunistic and literal, started steering people to the narrative. Summer, the hero who would surely give up the cottage. I watched strangers I used to swim with in childhood pools weigh in on my life like amateur judges. Step 2, enlist the church. It was slow and efficient. A cousin who was on the church board mentioned that practical Christian community sometimes meant communal living. A few members whom I had known as people who brought casseroles began to approach me at services with helpful suggestions and thinly veiled shock at my obstinacy. They asked if I had considered sacrificing for the family, as if sacrifice were a dessert laid out for public consumption. Step 3, administrative sabotage. I got a letter from my HOA accusing me of modifications to the property I had never made, an ornamental trellis allegedly erected without permit, a claim of noise complaints tied to suspicious activity. My mortgage statements, which had always arrived at my mailbox, suddenly turned into a scavenger hunt. A misdirected statement here, an email bounce there. At one point, I received a forwarded email showing an address change request that bore my name. Someone, I didn't yet know who, had used the fact that I'm a trusting person who returns calls to create openings and then exploit them. There's a kind of sick arithmetic to these assaults. Small inconveniences stacked until they resemble inevitabilities. The aim wasn't legal victory at first. It was exhausting me into acquiescence. But I'm not a person who cedes the last line without a fight. I tightened seams. I cut their access to the digital scaffolding they'd relied on. I changed passwords to accounts they knew. Birthday knowledge-based security questions were suddenly useless. I set up two-factor authentication. With an app, no one could peer over a shoulder to click approve. I signed up for credit monitoring and froze what I could freeze. I called the bank and had them annotate my file. Customer concerned about unauthorized contact. I printed out statements and sent them to an email address I controlled. I also legalized paranoia. I installed security cameras, little black eyes on the eaves and porch, and managed them like a nervous theater director, scrubbing through footage and embedding timestamps into files. I used the cameras to create a habit. Check the footage in the morning and at night. Archive suspicious activity. Keep a log. The cameras were ugly and practical, the way armor always looks. The cameras caught things. I learned to trust the grainy, unromantic truth of pixels. One night, the driveway filled with the bulky silhouette of an SUV. Maya's Bronco, the one with the faded bumper sticker about family first, idled under the porch light for 40 minutes. Shadows shifted in the windows. There were doors opening and closing in the grainy night. I called out, not to them, but to the people inside me who were waiting for me to cave. The country air tasted like pennies. When I called the police, it was not with melodrama, but with clear, factual sentences. "There is an unauthorized vehicle on my property," I said, and I gave them the house number. The operator's voice was kind and procedural, which was exactly the tone I needed. I had documented prior incidents on the cameras, and I told the dispatcher where to find the footage if they needed it. Within an hour, patrol lights pooled across my lawn like a strange blue tide. The officers were polite, efficient, and understanding in ways my family had not been. Maya and 2 others were escorted off the property. They left with the same composure with which they'd arrived, like people who'd been doing favors for themselves. The officers took statements. I stayed in the doorway as they wrote down what I said, my body humming with a strange mix of vindication and shame. Shame that it had come to this, and a fierce relief that the law had done what my family refused to respect, treat my boundaries as actual lines. After that night, things shifted. The intimidation continued, nasty comments online, anonymous letters, but the brazen attempts to occupy my property themselves seemed to falter. The cameras and the police had, absurdly, formalized what my words alone could not. One of my oldest friends, Ezra, came over with a lawyer friend and a stack of legal pads. He helped me draft a cease and desist letter. I learned that there is great cold comfort in formal language. The letter said, plainly, "Stop contacting me about the cottage. Remove all access to my accounts. Cease entering the property without permission." It referenced the police reports. It was not dramatic. It was a hammer in paper form. My coworkers, people I knew primarily as efficient collaborators around marketing decks and coffee runs, became an unlikely phalanx. Ava, Ben, and Rosa, who had been with me through late-night deadlines and shared bagels, started arriving at my door at odd times, sitting in a line when Maya's friends tried to knock. They would stand there, arms folded, politely blocking any attempt at just popping in. It felt ridiculous at first, having the people from accounting act like bodyguards, but their presence was a cultural sledgehammer. You could not casually claim that I was the one being unreasonable when 3 professional colleagues were literally on my porch. Extended family also slowly chose sides. My Uncle Harris, who had never been silent when injustice was served to others, called Maya out in a family group chat. Aunt Lila, who had been an ambiguous presence in the earlier weeks, messaged me privately with something that felt like redemption. "I'm sorry I didn't see it. I'll be there if you want." Their involvement was small but significant, a reminder that people can be complicated, but still land on the right side when facts are presented. There were nights I felt like a fortress commander, small, petulant, and very human, cataloging every scrape and casting shadows. There were other nights when I sat in the dark and felt a grief so deep it tasted like winter. But the tide had turned from free-floating assault to a war of documents and spectators. Every time someone tried to thread the needle of my generosity into a noose, I countered with evidence. Bank logs, screenshots of planning posts, timestamps from my camera. Paper and pixels beat charm and assumptions. The cease and desist worked in the sense that it raised the stakes. It made them realize the campaign had legal consequences. It made them pause. I knew legal letters aren't magic. They're just a different kind of muscle. But muscles, when tensed, stop opportunists in their tracks. Part 2 closes on a quiet, armored day. The SUV was gone. The cameras blinked like sentinels. I had a stack of documents in a folder that felt more potent than any sermon about family duty. My coworkers walked me to the car sometimes, like casual guardians. My friends checked in like nurses. The police had been called. The officers had taken statements. The HOA had been put on notice. I had done everything I could to make sure that if they tried to invade my life again, there would be a record, a trail, and people watching. This is not an ending. It's the fortification before the conclusion. The next confrontations would be the most dangerous, more emotional and more theatrical, because once they realized the legal and social levers were failing, they would try to return to manipulation. Guilt, pie on a windowsill, offers of help that smelled like traps. I learned an important lesson then, one that's both clinical and intimate. Boundaries are not passive lines you draw and forget. They are active practices. You have to enforce them. You have to make allies. You have to document. You have to be boringly persistent in ways that are deeply unglamorous. The cottage stood in the morning light, and it looked like a domestic thing again, instead of a contested map. I still ached. I still had to process betrayal and the way people you love can devalue your autonomy. But I felt steadier, like someone who had finally learned not to hand the rope to people who'd already decided to tie knots. They tried the oldest trick in the emotional playbook, dessert as diplomacy. It was a soft, late winter afternoon when Janet showed up at my door with a cherry pie balanced in a lacy towel, steam rising in polite curls. The pie looked like the apology she had practiced in her head for months. Perfectly domed, a lattice top that suggested effort, a smell that could make grown people confess petty crimes. She presented it like an offering to a goddess she assumed would be mollified. "Thought you might like company," she said, as if the weeks of planning, the copied keys, and the SUV outside my house had been minor scheduling errors. "We miss you. We can make this work for everyone. Just talk to us." The pie was a prop. The conversation was not a negotiation. I had rehearsed this scene a dozen ways with Ezra and the lawyer, but rehearsals don't keep your hands from trembling on the real stage. I wrapped my fingers around the dish and felt ridiculous, and finally, gloriously calm. "I'm moving to Arizona," I said. The sentence hung there like a ceiling lamp. Janet blinked slowly, the way people do when the script they thought they had is unexpectedly underlined. "I accepted a job in Phoenix. I'm selling the cottage." You could see the pivot work in her face. First disbelief, then bargaining, then the scrape of old patterns trying to reassert themselves. "But," we thought, she started, and then stilled because I had pulled the rug out from under the entire plot they had been drafting without me. I put the pie down on the kitchen island, but I didn't offer any. It felt petty to refuse food, and it felt necessary. Food is how they proposed to redeem decisions they had already made. This was not a communal event where crumbs could fix betrayal. "I'm selling it because it's mine," I said. "I saved for it, I closed on it, and I'm the one who's going to decide what it becomes. I'm also selling it because I'm done being treated like a place to park other people's demands." Janet's mouth made the small, tired smile of someone who had been taught that love is eminent possession. Maya stood behind her, arms crossed in a posture that tried to read as protective, but looked instead like a practiced stencil. Robert hovered, hands in pockets, looking like a man whose map had been redrawn. Then I did the thing I had been building toward since the first time I found Maya's key on her keyring. I opened my laptop. I started with the things that are hard to deny when they sit on a screen, the Facebook post from 3 weeks before closing. Maya's breezy photograph of a table with the caption about the bigger place, the screenshot of my father's message, "She'll give in. She always does." I played video from the security cameras, low-resolution, grainy glory that showed Maya's SUV idling on my driveway after midnight, a timestamp that matched an HOA complaint they'd filed. I scrolled through emails that weren't supposed to exist, a message thread where a bank manager was CC'd in a conversation about down payments, a forwarded email that had my name signed in a tone that sounded like me but wasn't. I watched faces change as reality, rendered in time-stamped pixels and dated posts unspooled. People who had once nodded politely now squinted at the screen, as if the images might be a trick of the light. My cousin, who had joked about communal kitchens at last year's barbecue, folded his arms and asked, "Why would you do that without telling her?" Aunt Lila's hand flew to her mouth. Some reactions were immediate and corrective. Uncle Harris, short, blunt, and allergic to politeness when it covers harm, stood up and said plainly, "This is manipulation." The room shifted. A few church members who had been circling the narrative of sacrifice cleared their throats and stopped offering advice. A neighbor who had been on the fence about my family's rumors leaned forward and said she'd seen the SUV on the driveway more than once. Of course, not everyone repented on the spot. Janet's defenses were the sort that decades of being the director of family stories had honed. Explanation, then minimization, then an attempt to fold the facts into a new story where she was the long-suffering martyr acting for the children's best interests. Maya tried a softer angle. We only wanted what was best for the kids. Robert tried to make it neat with, "We were thinking long-term." Their attempts at reshaping reality into benevolence made them sound small, and that smallness was instructive. I could feel the room doing that thing families do when the scaffolding of their comfortable myths starts to creak. Some people scramble to shore up the old beams. Others slowly walk away from them. I watched family members exchange glances that said, without formality, who was going to be on which side of a new fence. The climax was less dramatic than I'd imagined, and more satisfying for that fact. It wasn't fireworks. It was documentation. The footage and the posts did two things at once. They stripped the armor off the justifications, and they gave my relatives a choice to see what had been done in the light. Some apologized privately that day. A few sent awkward texts. Several relatives, not all, but enough, told my parents that they had crossed a line. That publicness was my revenge in the clearest sense, not malicious sabotage, but refusal to be erased and the small, surgical exposing of the plan they'd made at my expense. I hadn't set out to humiliate them. I had intended to stop them. But when people construct narratives that depend on someone's compliance, the exposure of that plot is a kind of consequence. The garden of decorum they'd planted got trampled, and their social capital wilted in front of their neighbors. Reputation, it turned out, is more fragile than casseroles. There was one final exchange that I remember because it was quiet and inevitable. Janet, who had been fond of theatrical pleas, finally asked, "Aren't you worried about us? About the kids?" That was a real question. Maybe honest, maybe performance. I looked at her and felt neither cruelty nor pity. I felt the steady, surprising thing that has its own gravity. I had room in me for both love and for self-defense. "I'm worried about you," I said. "I'm worried you'll think coercion is love. I'm worried you'll keep assuming my consent is an asset. But I'm not worried about us the way you mean it. I'm worried you won't learn that boundaries are how people grow." She ate the rest of the sentence like lemon. The pie sat on the counter, untouched and cooling. Selling the cottage was not surrender. It was a choice. There were sleepless nights before I signed the listing, and a small grief that surprised me with its edges. I had loved that cottage like a stubborn animal, and letting go felt like an ending and a mercy. I met with the realtor, signed papers, and negotiated a clean sale that protected my privacy and my finances. The offer that ultimately sold it came from a young couple who wanted to fix the garden. I walked them through the rooms one last time and handed them a key that had my name written on a sticky note. It felt right to hand it over on my terms. I accepted the job in Arizona because it was the beginning of a life where the center of gravity was mine. The job was good, with people I liked, and a salary that finally let me breathe. I found an apartment with a small balcony and succulent plants that require stubbornness rather than daily devotion. A practical metaphor for recovery. The first months in Phoenix were a patchwork of small delights and necessary practices. I learned that desert light is excellent for reading, that strangers in cafes are less invested in your life story than relatives, and that making new friends takes the same quiet courage as enforcing old boundaries. Ezra drove my couch across state lines. Ava and Ben pitched in for the moving company as a present. My coworkers threw a housewarming party where the music was loud and the questions were about my new job, not my family drama. I made a rule: no unscheduled visits, no unapproved key copies, and no living under someone else's timeline. I gave my family a contact window, a regular 2-hour slot once a week for calls, and they could take it or leave it. That container was small, inflexible, and merciful. It let me test whether they really wanted connection or only control. Many of them chose the latter and then wondered why I was distant. 1 year later, I could tell you the exact street where I'd planted a citrus tree in my yard, and I could tell you the names and subtleties of people who had become my chosen family. My manager, a woman named Lila, not my aunt, celebrated my work in ways my old family never had, with direct praise and promotions. My neighbors, a retired teacher who bakes bread and a barista who runs a weird book club, became emissaries of steadiness. Aunt Lila and Uncle Harris showed up when invited and were gentle allies. Maya texted on birthdays. We have a relationship now that fits into careful boxes and not into the open plan architecture she'd once proposed for my life. Legally and practically, I fortified my position. The locks stayed changed. Passwords stayed private. The cease and desist letter remained a document I could brandish in case of future trespass. There were no dramatic lawsuits, nothing cinematic. Instead, there was a quieter victory. I had built a life where I could make decisions without people presuming my permission. That is revenge enough for me, a life that stubbornly adheres to my own terms. Reflection is a dangerous thing. It can turn into self-congratulation if you aren't careful. But here's the honest ledger. I lost a house I loved, and I gained the knowledge that I was not a passive plot point in someone else's narrative. I saw the faces of people I thought I could trust and learned to accept their limits. I also found unexpected kindnesses, co-workers who became anchors, a legal letter that did what words alone could not, a community that wanted me for what I was, not what I could provide. Poetic closure arrived not as a dramatic showdown, but as a small, sharp moment. A year after I left, a neighbor sent a photograph. The cottage from across the street, the garden blooming under new hands. The caption, "New life, same light." For a second, I felt the old, complicated ache, a memory that sat with me like a fossil. Then I smiled. The cottage was serving someone else's dreams now, and mine were no less real for the fact they had started somewhere else. If there is a moral, it's not a sermon. It's a fact of human economies. People will trade your agency for convenience if you let them. The antidote isn't vengeance in the cinematic sense. It's persistent boundary work, evidence, and the sometimes tedious business of refusing to be rewired into someone else's plan. Justice, in my case, was not a courtroom victory, but a social and personal rectification. The truth on a screen, the police reports, the letters, the people who chose to see what had happened and called it by its name. Sometimes, late at night on my balcony, a warm wind comes up from the city and smells faintly of citrus and barbecue. I drink tea, and I think of pies. I think of how easy it would have been to take Janet's offering and let the story continue. I think about how much gentler the world is when you don't hand people the rope and tell them to tie. My revenge was simple. I lived. I sold on my terms. I moved on my terms, and I left them in the exact state they'd created for themselves. Exposed, needing to reckon with what they'd done. That consequence was kinder than cruelty. It was honest. It allowed me to keep my dignity and let them keep their choices. Years from now, if anyone asks, I'll say I let the facts do the heavy lifting. Facts, after all, are patient enforcers. And so I cook my own meals now. I choose my own curtains. I keep the extra key where only I can find it. The center of my small orbit is still me, and that is more than enough.